Hi, everyone. My name is Brianne Overton. I am a doctoral candidate in our PhD counseling program here at the University of Missouri St. Louis. I am a grief therapist and have been doing, oh my goodness, grief therapy, actually, grief support since 2007. So, for over 13 years, I've been working in the world of death, dying, and bereavement, and have been providing grief support and grief counseling as of 2013 when I became licensed in Illinois and then asked for reciprocity in Missouri. So I am licensed in both states on both sides of the water, both sides of the river, and provide grief counseling services for everyone: kids, teenagers, adults, couples, families. Um, and really work with a lot of people. I work in a lot of different capacities. I have a PowerPoint here for you, which is going to keep me on track because I can be very long winded. I love to talk about grief. I love what I do. And so I'm going to give you a glimpse of what it is that I do as a grief therapist, as a grief counselor. And hopefully, if you have questions or anything like that, like if anything comes up for you during this pre-recorded chat, please feel free to reach out to me via email. You can reach out to me via phone if you'd like. So I'll make sure that I post my contact information at the end so that you have that. Typically, I wear a grief shirt anytime that I do a grief chat. But I just got this really cool shirt and I wanted to wear it. One of my friends who also graduated from our program several years before I did, his name is Itoya White, um, has a shirt company called Theraties. And so my sweatshirt today says, "You good, sis? Hashtag mental health matters." So I'm always looking for ways to um, be visible in our community. I want people to know what I do. I want people to know that there are people out here like us that are ready and willing to offer support. So, like I said, I typically am wearing a grief shirt, whether it says, "Let's talk about it. Let's talk about death. Let's talk about grief. How can I support you?" I have a sweatshirt and a t-shirt. I have t-shirts that say "Got grief." So I'm always wearing something that really talks about, like, actually it's a conversation starter, right? So like my hope is that somebody sees this today and they say, maybe I'm not good, or I'm great, I'm doing well, thanks for asking. The purpose behind the grief shirts is really to talk about it, to get that conversation going, to let people know that there are people out here in the world that will talk about it, that will hold that space, and that aren't afraid to steer, that aren't afraid to be direct and have a very open and honest conversation. So, like I said, I have the PowerPoint here. I will go off the rail, of course, and talk about lots of different things. This presentation is actually the presentation that I presented in March at the mini grief conference in March. So, like I said, I'm not going to go through each of these slides, but this kind of helps me stay on track and helps us move forward. So I'll tell you a little bit about, I mean, I've told you a little bit about myself. I'll tell you a little bit about my journey, and then we will continue to move on. So before I get into this slide of what is grief, I'll tell you a little bit about my background. Um, I have a bachelor's in criminology, criminal justice, and psychology. Um, a lot of people say, why grief? Why did you start like psychology, criminal justice, and now you're here at grief? What, like, talk to me about the connections. How does that all work? How does that all fit? Um, I never knew exactly what I wanted to do or where I was going. But I've always just kind of let my journey lead me in the direction that feels right or that feels good for me in that moment. In undergrad, I had no idea what, I mean, I had all these ideas, right? Of I want to do this and I want to be this and I want to do that. And I didn't know until my very last semester in undergrad. I had to take a course to satisfy my duals, to satisfy my psychology requirements. And I just needed a course. I don't remember even what level it was, but I took a course called The Psychology of Death and Dying and fell in love with that course. Honestly, I took the course because I was like, it's going to be an easy A. I just need to finish the semester out so that I can graduate and move on to the next thing. Um, and hadn't really like decided on anything up to this point of what I wanted to do, what I wanted to do after graduation. Was I going to work? Was I going to go into graduate school? Like, what was that next step going to look like? What was this next phase of my journey going to look like? And I took this course and fell in love with this course. There were all these new terms and all this new information that I'd never known before. Of course, there were some terms that I'd known, right? Like funeral, everybody knows what a funeral is, or hearse, funeral director, like all of those terms were familiar with me. There were also terms like thanatology. What is thanatology? What does that mean? Give me more information. So, all of these other things in this course that just kind of drew me in. And from there, I went into a master's program of thanatology. So, I have a master's in thanatology from Hood College, which is located in Frederick, Maryland. Um, so I study death, dying, and bereavement. That's my basis for counseling is the background in death, dying, and bereavement. So studying there, we did a lot of research, grief-based research, death-based research, dying-based research. Um, and then I thought, I'm going to go work with people. I'm going to go be a thanatologist. I'm going to work with people. Um, Small problem, right? So can't there aren't a lot of jobs here in the Midwest that call for a thanatologist. If I wanted to work in a hospital, I needed to have a medical background. If I wanted to be a counselor, I needed to have a clinical background. If I wanted to teach, I needed to have an education background. So yes, I have this specialization, but I needed to attach that specialization onto something. And so it took a little bit of time to figure out what I wanted to do next after that. And I ultimately decided to enter into the counseling program at UMSL. So the, I have the Master's of Education in Clinical Mental Health Counseling. So it allowed me to attach this specialization onto my counseling master's degree. And from there, I was able to continue offering grief support, which eventually led into being a grief counselor and a grief therapist up to this point. Once I finished that program, I decided that I wanted to go into the doctoral program at UMSL as well. But my goal has always been, my mission has always been to have these conversations about grief, right? So I had been having these conversations about grief in our community, with community members, with people that live in our community, with hospitals and hospice organizations. And I wanted to be able to take it further than that. A lot of things that I've heard from other people that are seeking a grief therapist, that are looking for grief support, that I've seen many, many counselors, and all of them say the same thing. They all say they've worked with grief before, they've had grief clients before, um, and I trusted this person. I entered into this counseling relationship with them, this experience with them. And what clients find is that they keep having the same conversation over and over and over and over again. I think people, honestly, I think counselors see grief and they say, oh, it's just a grief. It can't be that hard, right? And it's not. It's really not that hard. But if you don't have the training, if you don't have the background, it's really hard to continue that conversation and to keep it moving. And so you do find yourself in a space where you continue to have the same conversations over and over and over again. And so when people find someone that has the experience, has the education, is not afraid to sit in that silence, is not afraid to sit in those moments that feel really uncomfortable for the client, they feel like they're being heard. They feel like they're being understood. They feel like they're receiving the support that they sought out. And so I take pride in what I do. I love, love, love working with the bereaved. I love being a grief therapist. I love being a grief counselor. And I'll talk more about all the things that I do along the way. Maybe I'll just talk about that right now. There's so many things that I've done with my degree. And one of the things that I like to tell my students is that you work really, really hard for your counseling degree. There are so many different levels to this degree, and I think people don't realize that as they enter in. So not only are you learning the material and soaking in all of this knowledge, but there's also this space. There's also this component of doing some self work, and you're doing a lot of work within, a lot of work on yourself that is encouraging you and pushing you towards or pushing you forward, right? There are lots of things that we as counselors in training, that we as clinicians, that we as counselors have to work through before we can sit across from someone and really be able to help them process their own stuff. If we haven't dealt with our stuff or we haven't processed our things, um, it's really, really hard to sit across from someone and help them process their stuff if you haven't even processed yours. So one of the things that I always tell my clients is like, I will never, ever, ever ask you to do anything that I haven't done myself. So if I'm asking you to think about this in a different way, if I'm asking you to step outside of what is comfortable for you, if I am asking you to do this journal or to do this homework or to put yourself in a different situation, like I'm asking you to do those things because one, I've done those things myself. Um, I know other people that have done those things. And I want to make sure that we're doing everything that we can do to be able to support you through this grief journey, along your grief journey. So I'll never ask a client to do anything that I haven't done. My clients shouldn't be my guinea pigs. My clients should really be um, there to learn more about themselves and to learn how to cope and to learn how to deal with and to learn how to move through. So my hope is that when they enter into this counselor client relationship with me, that that is built on trust, and that's also built on honesty so that we can form this bond, um, and build the rapport that we need for that solid foundation so that they know when I ask them to do something or when I encourage them to do something, like this is probably something that's going to be helpful. Um, and so for me, that's the why grief. Um, I work in a lot of different capacities. So I currently actually just started a new position with a camp that I have worked for the last 5 years as a clinician, as a clinical director. So I do grief camps in the summer. There is a local grief camp that I've volunteered for the past 13 years. It's through an organization called Annie's Hope. So at Annie's Hope, we do um, camp in June. I was trying to remember when it was. The first 2 weeks of June, we offer camp. And the first week is for our younger kids, so usually ages 6 to 12 or 6 to 11, depending on if those 12-year-olds are closer to 13 or closer to 11, just depending on the age. And then we have a teen camp, so for kiddos 13 to 18, that will come the second week. And then at the end of July, the entire month of August, I do my experience camps. So experience camps is a free 1 week camp, 1 week grief camp for children and for teenagers who have experienced the death of a parent, sibling, or primary caregiver. We currently have 5 locations with 10 programs. So we have our California location, which is called CalX. We have a Georgia location, which services the southeast part of the US. That camp is in Georgia and it's called Blue X because the camp that we are housed at currently is called Blue Ridge. So we call our camp Blue X. We have our West camp, which is called Midwest. And of course, it serves the Midwest, and that is located in Michigan. It is about 2 hours from Detroit and 2 hours from Chicago, so kind of right in the middle of those two cities. And then we have two camps that are in the eastern part, the northeastern part of the states. So we have a camp in Maine, and we also have a camp in Pennsylvania. So currently we have 5 locations. We're looking to open up our sixth location the summer of 2022. Super excited about that, and we'll be continuing to grow. So for experience camps, have worked as a clinician. I've also worked as a clinical director. My new role now is the chief clinical officer over all of our camps. So I have a clinical team at each camp. So one of the things that sets us apart is that at this camp, we offer a clinical program for all of our kids. So, regular camp, just like any other summer camp they would go to, they have lots of fun, participate in a lot of activities, a lot of team building activities. There's a lot of fun, right, that they're having throughout the week. Our clinical programming is there to offer them grief specific support throughout the week. So each day they attend either a sharing circle with their bunk or they attend a bereavement activity with their bunk. So they'll have two bereavement activities throughout the week. They'll have 2 to 3 sharing circles throughout the week. They also will participate in 3 campfires, which are clinically driven, which are usually led by our clinical directors. And it's really a way to set the tone for a week during that first campfire. The second campfire is really checking in. How are things going? What things are coming up for you? That third campfire is really the culmination of the entire week and being able to just reflect on camp, being able to reflect on your growth, um, being able to think about what are some of the things that I've learned here this week, and what are some of those things that I want to take with me as I go back home, out into the real world, is what we call it. So, with experience camps, each week we call it the best week ever. And so, all week long, we're pumping up the best week ever, best week ever. And then when the kids are not with us for those other 51 weeks throughout the year, 52, yeah, 51 weeks throughout the year, um, we send them messages, right, that are can't wait for the best week ever of 2021. And so we have shirts, we have all these things that say best week ever. Our kids love it, we love it. It's been really great. So I've done. I worked in the camp capacity and will continue to do that. I have a private practice. In my private practice, I see anyone that needs to be seen. That is dealing with grief. So I'd say 95% of my private practice is grief. I do as well, like loss and transitions, loss and life transitions. So outside of death, what does loss look like? What do those life transitions look like? Which could be divorce, it could be relocation, um, it could be loss of job, loss of ability. So if you're in an accident and maybe you're paralyzed from the waist down, or you know, maybe there are other things that have happened along the way and there's this loss. And so it's really being able to help people deal with the different losses that come up in our daily lives outside of death. I also have different contracts throughout Missouri and Illinois where I provide consultation, where I provide grief counseling services, where I provide grief support. So that may look like having different support groups that are connected to community centers or churches. That also looks like having contracts with the different hospitals, our local hospice organizations, local bereavement organizations and agencies, and different nonprofit organizations and agencies. Sometimes that's providing training, sometimes that's doing crisis response or crisis intervention, um, all things grief, right? So if you think of grief and like boom, 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 like all of these things are popping up, like those are all of the things that I do throughout the year to be able to support people. I always talk about let's talk about it, and it is grief, right? So being able to talk about it, let's talk about it, because we're not having enough conversations about grief. And so I always want to make sure that I am being an advocate for people that feel as if they don't have a voice. Um, One of those populations or one of those groups is kids, right? So um, a lot of times the adults are concerned about all of the other adults, right? And oh, they're just a kid. They don't really know what's happening. They don't really know what's going on. Um, let them play and let us grieve. And what we miss, that's a missed opportunity, right? Because we know that kids grieve. We know that, research shows us that um, babies as young as 6 months can pick up on change. Now, a 6 month old is not going to be able to verbalize that they're sad because their mom died, or they're sad because they don't get to see their grandma anymore, their grandpa anymore. But what they can do is show us with their behaviors and their different actions. So um, they pick up on that change, right? They know that now mom is not the one that is feeding me, someone else is feeding me. Like they pick up on those different changes. So we know that kids grieve. We know that 2-year-olds grieve. 3-year-olds can verbalize it. I work with a very advanced 2-year-old um, that verbalized everything, right? And so we did a lot of really good work when they were in that process of her person dying. Um, and so we know that kids grieve. They grieve differently than adults, right? So we know that kids, they learn through play. They also grieve through play. Um, so you may see kids, you might see a kid that's crying, and 2 minutes later, they're like, they've gotten up, they've wiped themselves off, and now they're gone off playing somewhere else. It doesn't mean that they're not grieving anymore. It just means that it's there, and now I want to go over here and do this. It doesn't mean that it stopped. It just means that they sometimes they take a break from it and they come back to it. But it doesn't mean that it's not happening for them. It doesn't mean that it's not going on for them. It doesn't mean that they're not feeling it. They just express it and experience it in different ways than adults. So I'll get back to this slide, which is what is grief. I always like to go through these different terms of grief, bereavement, mourning. What is anticipatory grief and what does that look like? Anticipatory grief and anticipatory mourning is actually my dissertation topic. So I like to talk about that a lot. Like, what is this when we're expecting a death, when there is an impending death? What are some of those changes that we experience? What are some of those things that we're going through? And then I always like to talk about complicated mourning as well. What does that look like? Um, what does people call it regular or normal grief look like? And what does it look like to have complicated mourning or complicated grieving? Um, and it's that state of intensified grief. And it may be sometimes people come in to see me, and it's been prime example. I had a person come in whose wife died when they were in their 30s. They had two small children. Um, and he was in his mid 30s. When he came to see me, he was in his 60s. Um, he had never, this was the first time that he was allowing himself to really express and to experience his grief. He put his grief on hold so that he um, could raise his children and give them the best possible life that he thought that he could in that moment. And so when he came in, there was a lot of complicated grief because this is something that he suppressed for over 3 decades of suppression. Lots of feelings, lots of emotion. Um, One of the things that I learned is that um, they didn't change anything at all in their home. So even up to this point of him coming to see me, um, his wife's clothes were still in the closet. Her slippers were still where she left them. All of those things were still in place. So we had to do there was a lot of work to do to get him to a place of feeling comfortable. There was a release that needed to happen for him. So grief does get complicated. Mourning does get complicated. It's not all this is what's going to happen. This is how I'm going to feel. Then I'm going to move on to the next thing. Um, it gets very complicated sometimes. I think there's also a misconception when you think about grief counseling and grief therapy. Um, I have some differences here for you, but grief counseling really is involving helping people facilitate uncomplicated grief or normal grief towards a healthy way of adaptation. And it can begin shortly after the death. Um, Traditionally, I like to wait a couple of months before I start seeing anyone for grief counseling or anyone for grief therapy. Before I see anyone, I want to know how they're coping, how they're adapting, what things have changed, what things are really hard. Like, I want to know, what are those natural coping skills? What does that look like? Is it, or is there denial? Is there avoidance? Have you jumped back into your routine and are trying not to think about what happened? Are you allowing your are you allowing yourself to feel? Are you allowing yourself to say, I'm not okay right now in this moment? Um, Grief therapy is a little different because grief therapy is for clients who experience complicated grief reactions. Um, and these can start a couple of months after the death. It can be years, years and years down the line. And there's this sense of unresolved grief, right? There's this, it's been 6 years since my person died, and I can't go on with life. I can't get out of bed. So those normal or those regular routines in life are not happening. There's a disconnect from the outside world. Um, and there are lots of different conflicts that need to be resolved so that we can move on to what this new normal is like, to be able to adjust in a healthy way to the new normal. And these are some different categories of grief therapy. So, working with people in grief therapy, we're typically working on that prolonged grief, that delayed grief, um, exaggerated grief, and then grief that may be masked as somatic or behavioral symptoms. Or symptoms, sorry. Usually the person is unaware that it is unresolved grief and they believe that there's something else that's going on. Like, I have this headache that won't go away and I've had it for months. Um, there has to be something else that is there. And we don't even think of grief as being an option because something else has to be going on, something has to be wrong. Um, Normal grief, which is also called uncomplicated grief, really encompasses a broad range of feelings, like we talked about before. Um, Typically, normal grief falls into these four categories. So, some of those behaviors um, you experience through your feelings, through physical sensations, your cognitions, or your behaviors. Theories of grief, my favorite part. Um, these are not, this is not an exhaustive list. These are some of the top theories in grief that typically people use. Um, if you've ever learned about grief, you probably have heard the first person's name, Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. Um, if you've never heard me say this before, if you've never heard anyone in life say this before, um, I want you to hear this. If there's only one thing, not two, one thing that you take from this presentation or from this chat, um, I want it to be this: there are no stages of grief. Oh, there, I said it. There are no stages of grief. Um, Anytime a person comes to me and they say, my last therapist said that I'm stuck in the anger stage, I get a little angry, kind of start to bubble up a little bit, because that tells me that you went to a person that is not trained in grief. And it's not the client's fault, right? It's the responsibility of the counselor to make sure that you are knowledgeable about what it is that you're telling people, about what it is that you're diagnosing people with, um, about that information that you're passing from one person to the next. Um, Prime example, I have lots and lots of lovely friends that are clinicians. Um, I'm the grief person, right? All of my friends have different, we all have different specialties. So I have two friends that are sex therapists. I have a friend that specializes in OCD. You have me as the grief person. I have another friend that specializes in trauma and like sexual assaults. Trying to think of my other friends. I have another friend that specializes in eating disorders. Like all of us have very, very different specialties. Um, so anytime someone comes my way and they need help that's outside of my scope, guess what? I send them to someone that can take care of them, someone that can support them. And I'm open and honest up front. This is what I do. This is the scope of my practice. This is the scope of what it is that I do as a therapist. I do all things grief. We can talk about grief. We can educate you on grief. We can do grief therapy. We can do grief support. We can do grief groups. But anything outside of that is just outside of my scope of practice. It doesn't mean that I'm not knowledgeable. It doesn't mean that I don't know about those things. It just means that when we get to a certain point in therapy, that's as far as I can take you. I am going to need to get you to someone else. And so I tell people that up front. Um, because I want to be open and honest. Like, this is the scope of my practice. This is the scope of what it is that I do. I have a great referral list, and I can get you to a person that can really support you with this issue or with this thing that you want to work through. But if it's outside of grief, it's not for me. And I think as an early therapist, there were, and not only just for me, but for other people, you want clients, right? I need clients, especially when you're working for licensure or when you're doing your field experience or doing practicum. I need the hours, I need the hours, I need the hours. But you get to a point of where you realize that, like, am I really helping this person? Am I really supporting them? Or am I just saying, made my hours for the week? Um, which in the beginning, that's what you're doing, right? You want to sit in front of as many people as you can so that you can get the experience, so that you can get the hours, so that you can be in a position to say, this is my scope of practice. All the rest of this is for someone else. I say all of that to say I have a friend that I love and admire. Um, we do grief consultation a lot because just of the clientele that she sees. And so, and every time we talk, I feel like she doesn't hear what I'm telling her about there not being stages in grief. Like, I don't know how else to say it. Um, there are no stages in grief. Um, but my friend will say, Brie, I think they're stuck in the anger stage. And I'm like, but they're not. They're not. So let me talk about. So Kubler-Ross has this stage model, right? The first stage is denial, second is anger, third is bargaining, fourth is depression, and fifth is acceptance. So anyone that knows about Kubler-Ross and her research knows that her, see, I'm rubbing my head like, oh my gosh, there are no stages. But anyone who has ever read about Kubler-Ross, researched Kubler-Ross, had interest in Kubler-Ross knows that she worked with a very specific population of people. The population of people that she worked with were all people who were dying. The majority of the people were dying from cancer. And so she talked about the different stages or the different I'm not even going to say phases, the different stages that people went through as they were dying, as they were getting to a point of acceptance, of getting to a point of accepting that their life was ending, right? So she says they go through the denial stage. This isn't happening to me. This can't be happening to me. I'm too young. I have too much to live for. Like all of those things, right? That we think about when we hear the word denial. And then they transition into this anger stage of being really, really upset and being angry um, about different aspects of life for different aspects of this diagnosis, but really, really being just angry with themselves. What did I do to deserve this? Angry with other people. Why did why do I have this cancer and this person does it? Maybe angry with their an higher power, higher entity of how could you do this to me? Why are you punishing me? Um, and then also maybe angry with just life in general. I have all of these great things going for me, and now all of that is going to be snatched away. And then transitioning into like this bargaining phase of maybe this isn't so bad. What if, what if, what if? Transitioning into depression of just being really, really sad that this is happening. Um, Thinking about all the things that they may be missing or that they're missing currently because they're doing treatment or they're going to stop treatment or their body is too weak. Um, and then into this stage of acceptance of accepting that um, they are dying, of accepting that they won't live past a certain age. Um, so what do we know? We know that Kubler-Ross is like the for one of the forerunners of grief theory. And so when she did this research, it was golden, right? It's still golden now, right? It's something that we can look back on. It's something that we've grown from. One of the things that we know is that people took this research and said, oh, this research was for people going through grief, right? Let's apply this to everyone else that is grieving, which takes her research out of context. Her research was specifically for this population of people who were experiencing their own impending death, who were experiencing their own mortality. And so when you take that out of context and you apply this to everyone else, it doesn't make sense, right? So when you look at some of these other theories, you'll see that like these things are there. These are just reactions, right? These are reactions to grief. That denial is there, that anger is there. A lot of other things are happening, a lot of other things are going on um, as people are thinking about their grief and what they're experiencing from someone else that is dying or from someone else that died. Hope that makes sense. I know I went off on a soapbox, but I really want you to remember that there are no stages of grief. None, zero. We know that grief is not linear, right? So there's not a start here, move here, move here, move here. Grief is more like one of these things, and that's how we grieve. Grief is sometimes all over the place, and you can't really put it into a stage phase. I'm sorry, into a stage model. Wolfeld's companioning, I'm going to just kind of skim through the rest of these. I'll also share this PowerPoint with Dr. Culver so that you have it in case you want to go back and look at it, because now I'm just going to kind of roll through just to make sure that I am talking about all of the things that I said that I would talk about in our chat today. Wolfeld's companioning model is a model that I use typically. Well, I'm sorry, it's a model that's typically used when you're working with kids, when you're working with teenagers, even adults. Um, this model is designed to really be able to just be present for the person, to be able to listen to them, knowing that the person that you're supporting is the expert in their own journey. And you are there as a companion, you're walking alongside them. So you're listening to their stories, you're recognizing and supporting the changing family roles. You're using their person's name, which a lot of times people don't feel as if that's important. That's really important. If I can say my person's name here, then I can feel comfortable saying it anywhere. A lot of times when someone dies, we stop talking about the person, we stop saying their name. But it's important to be able to remember that person's name and to be able to feel empowered to say their name. You encourage the connections to the deceased. You support all efforts to cope, all efforts to cope, whether we feel like those are healthy, whether we feel like they're unhealthy, whether we feel like they're positive or negative. We support those efforts, right? They are doing something to try to feel better. Now, let's figure out which one of those things actually do help and do work, and then let's get rid of some of those other things. But we need to make sure that we're supporting all their efforts to cope. You're normalizing all their grief feelings. Grief is very different for everyone, and it doesn't look the same, even if you're in the same family, even if you experience the loss of the same person. So if my mom died and my siblings and I are experiencing grief, we may not all grieve in the same way. Our relationship to our mom is different. Um, so you're also being able to educate about grief, and you have to be present. You have to be there. You have to show up. You have to be present. They have to know that you're there to support them. Um, there are 11 philosophies. I'll stay on this page for a couple of seconds and then move on to the next page. Like I said, you'll have this presentation, and I'll send it to Dr. Culver so that you can look through it. Number 10, it's about learning from others. It's not about teaching them. So, yes, I'm an expert in grief, but also it's that person's grief, right? So, if it's a Bree's grief, that's not a good example because I was going to say, can Bree tell you about her grief? Yes, I can definitely tell you about my grief, but I don't want someone else to tell me that I'm grieving wrong because there's no right or wrong way to grieve, that I'm not grieving the right way because, again, there's no right or wrong way to grieve. I'm the expert and I want to be able to teach my counselor about my grief. Martin and Doka's adaptive styles really talk about three primary grieving styles. So you have intuitive, you have instrumental, and then you have a blending of both of those styles. Um, if your primary grieving style is intuitive, you experience grief through your emotions, right? You're not afraid to express your feelings. You're not afraid to talk about your grief using effective language. You may be a person that cries, or people say they're wearing their feelings on their sleeve. That's an intuitive person. An instrumental person is a person who is grieving through their behaviors and through their and cognitively. So people are typically more task oriented with their grief. They need instructions. They need to be able to do something with their hands. You might see kids go out and play basketball because it's just too intense right now, and I need to like get this out of me. Um, and so they grieve in a different way. It doesn't mean that they don't express their feelings through tears or through their words, but for them, it feels more comfortable to be able to do it through their behaviors and through their thoughts. And then blended, of course, is just a blending of the two. I'm a blended griever. That's my style. I do both. Sometimes I need something physical. Sometimes I need a box of Kleenexes. It just really depends on how I'm feeling in that moment. And this really helps when you think about the person that's sitting across from you. It really helps when you're thinking about treatment and thinking about how to support them and how to help them. If I have a person that doesn't want to talk about their feelings or doesn't want to express their feelings through their emotions, then having them do all of these things that are targeting their emotions and targeting their feelings, it's probably not the best way to help them, right? So I may need to do something physical. I may need to give them a task, or we might be walking through different things. I always have dads who have teenage daughters. It's like, prom is coming up. I know there are all these things that she planned to do with her mom. I want to make sure those things happen. I need you to help me walk through these steps, right? Help me do this for my daughter. Um, I want to build um, a memorial for my dad. Help me figure this out. Can we brainstorm? Can we talk about this? And so that building is really helping them work through their grief. Dual process model. Oh, I don't know if I have a picture of the dual process model. Oh, yes, I do. Go me. Dual process model is really being able to you're oscillating through two different things. So there's loss orientation, there's restoration orientation. So you're moving, it's like this moving back and forth. And if you think about grief, it is kind of like this moving and the swaying of back and forth. So there's a lot of grief work that is going on here, and a lot of remembering, and that intrusion of grief of when I'm feeling okay and it's there and I can't get away from it or move from it. You have that denial and avoidance of restoration changes. And then over here, where it's restoration orientation, you have you're doing different things, you're building new relationships, you have new roles and new identities. So it's all the grief work, and then all of the things that help you kind of adapt to this new way of living, and you oscillate between the two. I hope that makes sense. So it's a dynamic coping model, model of coping with loss, in which an individual goes back and forth between loss orientation and restoration orientation. I wanted to make sure that I said that correctly for you. Warden's task model of bereavement is one that I use the most. So there are 4 tasks. I won't, like I said, I won't go into detail, but you'll have this presentation. The first task is to acknowledge the reality of loss, to acknowledge the reality of loss. So here it's important for the individual to realize that their person has died and that person will not return. This is huge. It's a big task because there's a lot of denial. This didn't happen to my person. They didn't die. Now, as we're living through this COVID pandemic, I didn't get to see my person in the casket. I didn't get to see them at the funeral. I only was at a memorial service. Where's their body? How do I really know that this person died? And so there's a lot of denial here. There's a lot of working through that so that we can move on to the next task, or so that we can feel comfortable saying that our person has died and that our person is not coming back. I steer clear from euphemisms. When you're working with people that are grieving, you should also steer clear of euphemisms. If they hear us using solid, concrete words, they are also going to use those solid and concrete words, and they hear them in a different way when it comes from you. So I always say died, dead, death, dying, as opposed to the person passed away. And when I say that, I want you to also know that I respect cultural aspects of grief, right? Because in my community, in the African American community, we do say passed away. We do say the person has gone on, right? And we know exactly what that means. A lot of times our 4-year-olds and our 3-year-olds don't know what that means. And so it's important for me to be able to use that the person has died, right? That the person is not coming back. And this is what happens to the body once someone dies. And so then as kids grow, they understand, oh, I know what passed away means. I know that that means that they're not coming back. I know that that means that they died. But it's important to be able to use those words, as opposed to they bought the farm, they're going on a long trip, they're just sleeping, like different things like that. That's a lot of confusion for a child. That's a lot of confusion for kids. And I think it reiterates that, like, we're in denial that this person is not coming back, that this person is physically not here anymore. Task 2 is to process the pain of the grief. This is also I'm going to say all of these are huge tasks. This is a huge task as well. You're really working through the pain of the grief. And this is often a very difficult task to complete. It's necessary for the individual to experience the pain of the grief, right? Because a lot of times we have people that suppress that, which just prolongs their period of mourning, which prolongs that period of intense grief. So processing the pain of the grief is the second task. Task 3 is to adjust to the world, without the deceased. So it is finding the new normal. What is this new normal going to look like? It's adjusting to that new normal. It's being able to understand what was lost and how that's a part of the grief work. Excuse me. Loss means different things to a lot of people. A lot of times survivors are often unaware of the important roles that the deceased person played in their life for a period of time after their death. Like I talked about the dad with the daughters, right? Of like, this was something that my wife was going to do. Like, this is something that was never on my radar. Also thinking about people, maybe sometimes people work in the home and they don't work outside of the home. And Or you have a person that is, he always took the kids to school on his way to work. Now I have to do this, right? So it's thinking about all those different roles that the person played in their life, and how are we adjusting to this new normal without them being physically there, physically present. Task 4 has changed over the past couple of years, but now it's to find an endearing connection with the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life. So it's creating that balance. It's really reinvesting in the new reality of that new normal. It's being able to remember the person that died and continuing to live a full and meaningful life. What does that balance look like, and how do we help people to find that for themselves? All right. Um, some of Warden's counseling principles. We're helping the person actualize the loss. You're assisting living without the deceased. You're helping find meaning in that loss. You're helping find ways to remember the deceased. Helping people interpret what normal behavior is and what that looks like. You're making sure you're allowing for individual differences, and you're being able to identify pathology, and refer out. If you need to refer a person out, that's important too. Like I talked about, like my scope of practice is this. If there are other things that are coming up that are interfering with that grief work, we need to have a conversation about that. And maybe we need to get you seen by someone else before we can continue our journey together. These are children's morning tasks and changes. So early tasks are really understanding self-protection. Who's going to keep me safe? Who is going to take care of me? What do you mean my mom died? What does that mean? Where did she go? Middle task is just that emotional acceptance, being able to emotionally accept that the person isn't here physically anymore, reevaluating the lost relationship, and dealing with the pain. Late task, forming a new sense of who I am, investing in those new relationships. So kind of like, the 4 tasks from Warden, and these are just kind of, pressed into 3 tasks for them. I'm sorry, for them, for kids. Different useful techniques. Meaning reconstruction model. So this is a theory that's rooted in constructivist psychology. Um, and this is Dr. Niemeyer's work. But this is an individual quest for existential meaning in life. There's no objective truth. If you've ever had Dr. Catoni, you know that he talks about this, right? There's no objective truth. You're using a lot of narrative and storytelling, um, as a way to help people make sense of their lives. They have to find this way to reconstruct their personal narrative, that will help bridge the past with the future. And here's the model. So it's that significant loss, it's that initial appraised meaning of loss. Um, is the appraised meaning decrepit with global meaning? No, you go down to adjustment and going back. If it's yes, then it's distress and meaning making, and you're reappraising the meaning. And it's this cycle that continues on at different phases and when different things are happening in life. Here are some guidelines for supporting children and teens. I'm just going to go through these, because you'll have this later. Things we should all know about grief. We all experience loss. There's no way around grief. The best way is through. There are positive ways to work through grief and to deal with loss. I need an S there. There are positive ways. We grieve uniquely, but it is not unique that we grieve, because we all grieve. Grief hurts. Grief has the ability to make you question everything in life. Grief involves changes in all aspects of life. I have some myths here. I'd love for you to kind of read through those and explore those. Grief lasts a month, a year, or a week. We know that grief is not linear. We talked about that earlier. Crying is a sign of weakness. Friends can help by not bringing it up. All myths. I would love to have a conversation with you about why these are myths. So if you'd like to chat, email me. Um, that is the end of that. I'm just going to read through my notes to make sure that I kind of covered everything. Um, Professional organizations. I'll make sure that I add some information on here as well. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'll make sure that I add information for you so that you have that as well. Two organizations that I belong to, NAGC, which is the National Alliance for Grieving Children, is a great, great resource if you're working with children and teens. Also, if you work in a school, or other organizations that support kiddos. There are lots and lots of resources to use for kids. Also, ADEC, so it's the Association of Death Education and Counseling. Um, I've been a member of both organizations since 2008 or 9. Um, I'm on the board, the credentialing council for our board for ADEC. So I'm not only a member, but I am an active member of both organizations. Um, Through ADEC, there are a couple of certificate programs if you're interested in those. There's the certification of thanatology. So there's an exam that you take, you submit a portfolio, and then you sit for the exam. Then you can say that you're a certified thanatologist. And then the second program up from that is a fellow in thanatology. So I am an FT. I was a CT, and now I'm an FT. So it's just a bigger portfolio. It's being able to say that you are knowledgeable in different areas of grief. So there's teaching, there's presentations, there's training, there's research, there's offering counseling support, there's supervision. There are all of these different areas of grief. And you fill it, you do your portfolio, you submit it. They tell you that you've been approved or you haven't been approved. So this is year 3 that I've been at FT. It's actually time for me to renew. Thanks for reminding me. I think I talked about everything. I hope this wasn't too long for you. I hope that you, I hope that this presentation was a good starting point for you. If you haven't talked about grief or haven't learned about grief before, please feel free to contact me. Please feel free to reach out to me so that we can talk more. If you have questions, I'll also add a video so that you can watch a short video about camp. I love camp if you're interested in camp or supporting kiddos in grief. If you're looking for clinical, if you're looking for internships or hours or anything like that in grief, please feel free to reach out to me. I enjoyed being in your class today, and I look forward to hopefully meeting some of you soon. I hope you have a good day. Thank you so much. Bye.